We were all stunned by the loss of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia this week. Joining us to talk about his lasting legacy on the court is Harvard Law professor ANN GLENDON. And later, a close Scalia friend and colleague, Judge Martin FELDMAN, joins us to talk about the faith and work of Justice Scalia. And finally, Christians and religious minorities in Iraq and Syria continue to face extermination at the hands of ISIS. Why won't the U.S. declare it a Christian genocide? The director of the Center for Religious Freedom, SHEA, will tell us. The World Over Live begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. ANN GLENDON, Judge Martin FELDMAN, and SHEA are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show or if you have a question, I'll be live tweeting throughout. You can find me on Twitter at Raymond Arroyo, or you can email me at worldover@EWTN.com. Let's get to it. Here's the brief news from the world over this week. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia is being remembered here in Washington and across the country. Justice Scalia was found dead on Saturday of apparent natural causes. He was visiting with friends at a private resort in West Texas. He was 79. Appointed to the High Court by President Ronald Reagan in 1986, he quickly became known as a strong voice of originalism, a fidelity to the original intent of the framers of the Constitution when judging a case. Scalia is perhaps the most influential jurist in the last half-century. Justice Scalia's Supreme Court chair and bench were draped in black on Tuesday, as was the main entrance to the Supreme Court chambers. He was a devout Catholic, husband and father of 9. EWTN will be carrying live coverage of Justice Scalia's funeral mass on Saturday, February 20th at 11 a.m. from the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception here in Washington. We extend our heartfelt condolences to his wife, Maureen, his family, and countless friends. May Nino Scalia rest in peace. More on his life and legacy in our next segment. And President Barack Obama made it clear that he will nominate a successor to Justice Scalia. In a press conference on Tuesday, he dismissed calls by Republicans to leave the nomination to the next president and warned the U.S. Senate not to be obstructionist. The president said he will nominate someone indisputably qualified for the vacancy on the High Court.
I'm going to present somebody who indisputably is qualified for the seat, and any fair-minded person, even somebody who disagreed with my politics, would say would serve with honor and integrity on the court.
More on the election year politics of a nomination later with ANN GLENDON. And Pope Francis concluded his 6-day apostolic visit to Mexico on Wednesday. The Holy Father delivered a message of hope and support in a country that is plagued by the drug trade, corruption, violence, and poverty. On Tuesday, he told Mexico's youth in Morelia to resist the lure of easy money from drug dealers who sow nothing but destruction and death. He urged them to turn to Jesus, who gives us hope and never asks us to be a hitman. After the youth event, Pope Francis showed a moment of frustration with some overzealous faithful. A person or persons pulled at the Pope from behind a barrier. He lost his balance and fell against a boy in a wheelchair. A visibly angry Pope Francis rebuked the offender, saying twice, "Don't be selfish." He did continue to greet and wave to a few more people before taking his leave. And the Pope concluded his Mexico visit in Ciudad Juarez, just across the U.S. border. In the shadow of El Paso, Texas, the Holy Father celebrated Mass in an apparent show of solidarity with the thousands of migrants who cross the U.S. border annually. As he has throughout his pontificate, Pope Francis spoke of the plight of migrants and called for them to be welcomed. It was indeed a cross-border event. An estimated 200,000 attended the Ciudad Juarez Mass, with thousands more looking on from a giant TV screen inside the El Paso Sun Bowl. Earlier in Juarez, Vatican spokesman Father Federico Lombardi fired back at Donald Trump, who last week criticized Pope Francis as being very political, claiming that he doesn't understand the problems our country has with immigration. Speaking to reporters at the site of the border mass, Father Lombardi rejected Trump's charge that the Pope was being political by raising the issue in Mexico. He noted, the Pope always talks about migration problems all around the world and of the duties we have to solve these problems in a humane manner. He further chided the Republican presidential candidate, saying Trump would know this if he came to Europe. North of the border, Trump has increased his lead in the latest national polls. He stands at 39% in the latest Quinnipiac poll. That's more than double his closest competitors, Senators Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. Pope Francis is coming under fire from the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church after his historic meeting and joint declaration with Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill this past week. The major Archbishop of Kiev says the faithful there felt betrayed. He took particular note of a part of that joint declaration concerning the Ukraine, which invited all the parts involved in the conflict to prudence. The Archbishop, whose church supported Kiev's campaign against pro-Russian separatists in the east, said the word conflict was inappropriate, as it suggested a civil conflict rather than a foreign aggression. He further charged that the Russian Patriarch openly supports Moscow's aggression against Ukraine. Archbishop Shevchevik was apparently surprised that he was not consulted in the drafting of that joint document, despite being a member of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for promoting Christian unity. And the Archbishop of Mosul in Iraq is confirming the dire situation for Christians there. Syriac Catholic Archbishop Yohanna Boutros Moshe said in a recent speech that his diocese, which has been controlled by the Islamic State since 2014, is at its end. He reported that ISIS no longer recognizes any dignity of the human being. For them, the value of life is zero, comparable to that of a cow or a pack of cigarettes. We are in great danger, he says. This is the area in Iraq where the 6th century monastery of St. Elijah stood until it was leveled by ISIS. Archbishop Moshe further pled with Pope Francis and all those of goodwill, asking for prayers and compassion for Iraqi Christians who have lost everything except their faith. And the EWTN family has lost one of its most beloved television personalities. Bob Lord, spouse and on-air partner of the late Penny Lord, died this past Saturday. He was 80. EWTN viewers know Bob and Penny Lord for their long-running Super Saints series, where the two would offer faith-filled lessons at shrines and holy sites around the globe. Together, the couple produced more than 200 shows and wrote 25 companion books on the Catholic faith. Our deepest condolences and prayers go out to the entire Lord family. I imagine Bob and Penny are together again, touring the heavenly sights. May Bob Lord rest in peace. And a major renovation is underway at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. The first phase of the extensive restoration project is complete. Structural repairs, soot removal, and the restoration of priceless mosaics have literally brightened up the 4th century church. It's built on the spot where Christians believe Christ was born. The work was authorized by the Palestinian Authority and financed mostly by Palestinians. Nearly $8 million has been spent on the project. It began in 2013. Though the majority of Palestinians are Muslim, the Church of the Nativity is considered a national treasure and one of the most visited tourist sites in the Holy Land. And I have a little surprise for our viewers. I'm delighted to share with you, and I promised this last week, a sneak peek trailer of my forthcoming book for kids of all ages, Will Wilder, The Relic of Perilous Falls. The book hits stores on March 8th, but I wanted you to see this little teaser trailer. Now, it's not the full trailer, and that's coming in a few weeks, but take a look at this.
12-year-old Will Wilder sought a relic with rare powers. Now, he has awoken an ancient evil and must embrace his destiny. to save Perilous Falls from unimaginable danger. Dean Koontz raves great fun and great frights. Chip Flaherty calls it a pulse-pounding page-turner. Think Indiana Jones meets Percy Jackson. The search for the next epic must-read adventure series is over. Will Wilder, The Relic of Perilous Falls by Raymond Arroyo, premiering March 8th from Random House Kids.
Will Wilder, The Relic of Perilous Falls, the first in the Will Wilder series, hits bookstores March 8th, but it's available now for pre-order at the EWTN Religious Catalog, at Books A Million, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. And if you pre-order and you send me your contact info at raymond@raymondarroyo.com, I'll send you a limited edition autographed bookmark. I've also posted the winners of our Will Wilder box contest on my website as well. So excited for you and your families to read this new, exciting adventure series. When we return, Mary Ann Glendon will react to the loss of Justice Antonin Scalia. What was his legal legacy? And what will his absence mean to the future of the court? The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. The U.S. Supreme Court lost one of its towering members this week. After nearly 30 years on the bench, Justice Antonin Scalia passed away during a hunting vacation in Texas at the age of 79. He was beloved by conservatives and criticized, sometimes brutally, by progressives. Still, he was respected by people on all sides of the ideological spectrum. His often scathing dissents were legendary, as was his wry sense of humor. What will be his lasting legacy? To discuss the work and the mind of Justice Scalia, we're joined by the learned hand professor of law at Harvard University, Mary Ann Glendon. Mary Ann, thanks for being here.
It's a sad occasion, Raymond, but it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you about a towering figure in American law.
Why was he such a towering figure, Mary Ann? I mean, some have dismissed him as a conservative. He's a conservative jurist, and that tells the tale. That really undercuts and undersells his importance, doesn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, the reason why he will be long considered to be one of the 2 or 3 greatest persons we've had on the U.S. Supreme Court is precisely that he followed a judicial method that makes it very difficult to cabin him with any label such as conservative. Or even, I would say, the words that he used himself sometime, originalist and textualist, don't really do justice to what he was. As soon as you put an ism at the end of a word, that suggests that he was some kind of fundamentalist, and nothing could be further from his judicial philosophy, which was a profound dedication to 2 things. First, to be true to the judicial oath that he swore to decide cases without respect to persons, that is, to be perfectly impartial, and to decide cases according to the laws and Constitution of the United States.
Yeah, no, he was, and he was so true to that. Often, when one peers and looks back, as I've been doing this week, when you look back at his rulings and the thoughts and the vision that informed those rulings, one is struck by the diversity, the surprises of his opinions. And I've got to share this with you. This is one of those cases that I think people will continue to read, and it gives you not only insight into his mind, but of course what the Constitution demands. It was that flag burning case in 1984. He was fairly new to the court, and he wanted to underscore the arbitrary nature of the Texas flag protection law. And he asked the consul, what other cherished symbols of the state would you like to protect from desecration? And he said, perhaps the state flower. And the courtroom erupted into hysterics. And later on, he continued sort of digging into this. He said, the only reason to burn the American flag is to express discontent with America. So by burning or banning flag burning, Texas was stifling an anti-American expression. And in response, the attorney who was arguing on behalf of Texas tried to argue that one might burn a flag to honor the country. Scalia instantly challenged her to describe a single instance where that might occur. This is typical Antonin Scalia, it seems to me.
Yes, and it's a perfect illustration of why it is so distorting to call him a conservative, to label him as a conservative. He disappointed many conservatives many times, not only in the flag-burning case, but you can think of the shock that his decision in the Employment Division versus Smith case that religious freedom did not protect sacramental users of peyote. That was quite a surprise to many people. And of course, the many decisions where he upheld the rights of criminal defendants pleased many people who would call themselves liberals. So I think of him as most like, among all the justices, most like the other great justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who followed a judicial philosophy very similar to Justice Scalia's, let the chips fall where they may, be true to the Constitution's text, structure, and precedent.
And do you see that approach to the law and certainly to jurisprudence, do you see that slipping away as you look at these other decisions that are being handed down and the politicization of the courts all over the country?
Well, what I see is that when Nino Scalia joined the Supreme Court, it was slipping away, seriously slipping away, and he came in sort of like a drill sergeant and forced not only the court, but advocates and legal academics to shape up, to be more rigorous in their reasoning, and to pay attention to the text. And I think after 30 years, we can say that an important part of his legacy is to have improved the quality of judicial reasoning.
Yeah, no doubt at all. I came across this funny quote, Marianne, because he was a Roman Catholic, and I'm going to play a little clip of him speaking at a National Catholic Prayer Breakfast here in D.C. But he didn't allow his Catholicism or his faith ever to get in the way of his ruling. Now, some have criticized him for this. Others have condemned him for being a Catholic and thought he brought those ideas to the bench. I'm going to play this little bite and then get your reaction.
I find it hard to understand the reasoning of those wise people who revere Thomas More as a saint rather than a world-class fool for dying to support the decision of Medici Pope Clement VII concerning King Henry's divorce of Catherine of Aragon, but who themselves ignore and indeed positively oppose the teachings of Pope Benedict on much more traditional and less politically charged subjects.
Marianne, you heard what he just said there. At the same time, Justice Scalia was firmly for the death penalty, even saying at a Pew Forum once, you want a fair death penalty? You kill, you die. That's fair. How did he keep those two things separate? The teachings of his church, being true to his church, and yet ruling where he thought he had to, even if it violated the tenets of his faith.
Well, first of all, I would defy anyone to find any direct influence of Catholic beliefs on his judicial decisions. He was a paragon of a certain kind of restraint that characterized Holmes and that is really required by the judicial oath. When he took the judicial oath, he didn't have his fingers crossed behind his back. And that restraint means you accept the limits imposed by the structure of our government, federalism and the separation of powers. You accept the limits imposed by the text and precedent, and you accept the personal limits of keeping your own opinions, biases out of the decision-making process. Nobody can do that perfectly, as he was the first person to say, but he was always careful to explain his decisions with reasons that are accessible to anyone. Now, you mentioned his view on the death penalty.
Yeah.
He thinks, he said in a speech that he gave in 2002 that he thought that that part of Evangelium Vitae was an innovation that really was not supported by the tradition and the texts. It's rather interesting. He used the same kind of argument that he would use when there were new rights suddenly found in the Constitution. If you want new rights, they've got to come through the ordinary democratic process. So he was full of surprises, but in a way that showed enormous integrity and fidelity to his principles. I do think that I was thinking about Catholic influence on him. And I think there is a way in which you could say being a Catholic did influence the kind of justice he was. And that is any Catholic who takes seriously the baptismal obligation to aspire to holiness and mission. That means you have to learn to discipline yourself to do really hard things. And I think a person who was brought up as Nino was, who lived as he did, was able to do what many judges find hard to do, and that is discipline himself to decide according to the laws and the Constitution.
Yeah. No, beautifully said. I want to talk about the outstanding cases, Marianne, in our final moments here. There are several outstanding cases before this court of real importance, certainly to this audience. One is the Texas restrictions on abortion, where the doctor has to have admitting privileges, the abortionist does, and they have to have medical personnel at the abortion clinic. This is under review. Without Antonin Scalia, which way do you see this going, as well as the big HHS contraceptive mandate case that is before the court?
Well, should that Texas case be decided 4-4, that decision will affirm the lower court decision, which was in favor of the regulations on abortion clinics. And so that decision will stand, but it will not stand as precedent. And as your audience knows, there are other states who have similar regulations, and certainly those regulations can be defended on the grounds of providing health protections for women. And I think that that when that case comes up again, perhaps in the context of testing one of those other statutes in other states, that there is a reasonable chance that those regulations will be upheld. Of course, a lot will depend on who is the next justice.
Right.
And of course, the Little Sisters of the Poor, that if that's a 4-4 decision, that will let the lower court decision stand, and that went against the Little Sisters. And that, of course, is an extremely important case, but it is not precedent, and the issue will not go away.
I need to play this for you. This is your former law student, President Barack Obama, talking about the type of justice he might appoint any day now. Listen to this.
Should we interpret your comments just now that you are likely to choose a moderate nominee? Would you consider?
No.
Okay.
I don't know where you found that. You shouldn't assume anything about the qualifications of the nominee, other than they're going to be well qualified.
Your thoughts on this, Marianne, and is the GOP in the Senate, the majority there that runs the Senate, are they correct, in your estimation, to come out and say, we're going to oppose any nominee, this president shouldn't be making these appointments now? The country's too divided.
Well, of course, it's very sad that we have come to a point in our politics where we cannot take the best jurist in the country and have him confirmed without any opposition, as Justice Scalia was, no votes against him. It's sad that we have reached this point. I think that's about all one can say about this sparring that goes on before Justice Scalia is even buried, this lining up on partisan lines about an appointment where I keep coming back to the judicial oath. All we want is somebody who can take that oath and mean it and live it the way Oliver Wendell Holmes did and the way Nino Scalia did for 30 years.
That's a perfect way to end this. Mary Ann Glendon, thank you so much for being here and for your searing analysis of not only the law, but of Nino Scalia's great legacy. Thank you.
It was my pleasure, Raymond. Thank you.
We'll talk soon. When we return, close friend and colleague of Justice Scalia, Judge Martin Feldman joins me to remember his dear friend and his godfather when the World Over Live continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to the World Over Live. He was one of the most influential jurists of his generation, a wonderful dinner companion, a dedicated family man, and a devout Catholic. Justice Antonin Scalia's passing on Saturday left a void in the court and also in the lives of many friends and family. Earlier this week, I spoke to U.S. District Court Judge Martin Feldman from New Orleans about his dear friend and godfather, Antonin Scalia. Take a listen. Judge Feldman, tell me, how did you learn of the passing of Nino Scalia this week?
Oh, by accident, I happened to turn on one of the TV news stations that afternoon, and there was his face on the TV screen, and I thought to myself, oh, goodness, now what has he done? And it took about 5 minutes for I was so stunned to realize that that he had passed away. But just by accident, I later spoke with Mrs. Scalia. She called me later that evening, but I just learned by accident on the TV news.
Now, you all were very close. You were friends for more than 30 years. Tell me how you first met. He drove up to the front of your house one day. That's right.
My late wife and I were involved with a program at Tulane University called Directions. And this was April of 1984. And Directions for that year always had a theme, and they always had what I teasingly later told him was a big shots panel. And he was on the D.C. Court of Appeals. I had just been appointed to the district court. And the other two panelists, he was one of the panelists, the other two panelists were the famous law professor Arthur Miller and Fred Friendly, who was chairman of CBS News.
Right.
And Tulane asked my late wife and I to give the big shots party at my house. And they were all there except for Nino. And I got kind of bored and I walked out on the front porch because I don't really like crowds. And this beat up little car pulled up, and this guy got out and walked up, and his first words to me were, Judge Feldman, and I said, Judge Scalia, and we became instant friends. In fact, my wife was very angry with me because he and I both ignored everybody else at the party, and we just went off into a corner and became instant friends.
Now, in your chambers in New Orleans, you even have a room dedicated to him with some historical significance. Tell us about that.
I do. It was, I want to say, 2001 now. It was the Kylo decision involving whether or not flying over your house and doing thermal imaging for drugs and marijuana was an unreasonable search and seizure. And he happened to be visiting me in New Orleans and was staying at my house. And he said he had some work to do. And could he come to chambers? Well, I had a little extra conference room where he could work, and I said, we'll go to lunch when you finish. And about 11:30, I went in to see him, and we were going to go to Galatoire's, and you're familiar with one of our famous restaurants here. And I went in to the little conference room, and he was typing away on his laptop, and I said, "What time do you want to go to lunch?" I was just standing in the doorway, and he said, "Let me finish this, and we'll go." And so I said, "What are you working on?" And he said, "I can't tell you. You're not going to agree with me, but I will send you a copy of the decision the minute it comes out." Huh. And when I first started reading the decision, I didn't agree with him until I got to his footnote about the 18th century history of search and seizure. And typical of him, he convinced me.
I want to talk about his faith for a moment, Judge, and I know it had an influence on your personal journey.
Yes.
This is a quote from Antonin Scalia, Justice Scalia. I want to share with the audience. This is from 2005. He was speaking at a Knights of Columbus Council. He said, "God assumed from the beginning that the wise of the world would view Christians as fools, and he has not been disappointed. If I have brought any message today, it is this: have the courage to have your wisdom regarded as stupidity. Be fools for Christ, and have the courage to suffer the contempt of the sophisticated world." How did that expression of faith influence you, and was it instrumental in your personal conversion?
Yes. I had been, not to be personal, because this is about Justice Scalia, but ever since I was a teenager, I had been drawn to the church. And he knew it, and Maureen knew it, and so Nino would send me books, and we would talk for years and years. And I have always felt, it's ironic that you bring up that quote, because I was teasing him at lunch when the Pope was in D.C. I was in D.C. and we were at lunch, and I said to him, "You know, if you had lived 2,000 years ago, you would have disagreed with Jesus, but you would have eventually become one of the apostles." And I still believe that.
And did what of his faith, as a jurist yourself, did it affect, was there any reticence on your part of officially joining the Catholic Church? Because Antonin Scalia was often wrapped, some say his faith preceded his judgment and was part of his judgment, that he brought that to the bench with him. Was that a concern for you at all? And is that a fair criticism of Justice Scalia?
I think it's fair to say that we all look at issues through whatever background prism we relate to. We still strive mightily, and he certainly did, to be fair and impartial. And I think that he was always able to remain immensely faithful to his faith, but also to his obligations as a judge. And there, as you know, there are many instances throughout his history as a judge and on the Supreme Court where he did not go along with the so-called conservative mindset. He had a kind of a libertarian streak in him. So, no, he had a great influence on me and on my faith, but I don't think that he ever felt conflicted, and I certainly have never felt conflicted.
And he was your godfather, which a lot of folks didn't know.
About 10 years ago, when I finally decided that I was going to be baptized, I was going to make official what had been unofficial most of my life. I called him, and I said, "All right, I'm going to be baptized. I'm going to study for it. Will you be my godfather?" And he said, "Marty, I have been trying to get into heaven all my life, and you're going to slip in right ahead of me." And that's how he agreed to be godfather to me.
You spent time with him at dinners with Justice Sotomayor, Justice Breyer. I know you spoke with some of them in the wake of Justice Scalia's passing. What did they say about his role on the court and how he'll be missed?
Well, he was beloved. He went out of his way to be friendly socially with Justice Breyer, who said to me yesterday that a glow in the court has grown dim. He had Justice Sotomayor and me to dinner at his house with just him and Maureen. He was an incredibly beloved colleague. And you knew where you stood with him. He never minced words. As you know, Justice Ginsburg has been his closest friend for decades.
Yeah.
They probably didn't agree that they were even friends. But they remained friends even though they didn't agree on most issues.
Judge Feldman, give me a sense of his influence in those weekly conferences. And does that in any way inordinately tip the balance of the court? Because I know Justice Scalia was so demonstrative, so willing to engage and have a debate. I imagine he had great influence in those conferences where all the justices sit and sort of hash out the cases.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you and the audience because he never, ever revealed a secret of the court to me. Not ever. We would talk about issues, but he never told me what went on in conference. He never told me about conversations with other justices regarding cases pending before the court. I knew a lot about his relationships with the justices socially. I knew a lot about what he thought of some of them and what he didn't think of some, which I'm not going to repeat here.
Okay.
But he never once ever violated the oath of secrecy and privacy of the court's conferences.
Judge Feldman, before I let you go, your final thoughts on his lasting influence, particularly as the vanguard of originalism, cleaving to what the Constitution prescribed and interpreting accordingly.
Well, I don't know whether he'll be remembered for his opinions in the majority or his very powerful dissents. But I think what will have a profound influence on the law and our society as a whole is quite simply how much sense he made, how his opinions and the language he used were pure poetry in rhythm, in visualness, in power, and in emotion. And I think that when history looks back on him, history will remember him for being the justice who made the most sense.
Judge Feldman, thank you so much for being here and for remembering this man who, in addition to his great legacy that he left on the court, personally, he was an hilarious and forthright dinner companion and a really good man and a good father.
I will leave you with just one thought about how beloved he was. He invited Justice Sotomayor and me to dinner at their house one night out in McLean, and she picked me up and we drove out there and pulled up in front of the house, and we got out of her car and I rang the doorbell. He came to the door, he opened the door and he looked at the two of us and he said, "Ah, the odd couple."
Well, we'll leave it there. A perfect way to end the segment. Judge Marty Feldman, thank you so much for joining us from New Orleans and for your reflections on your friend, and our deepest sympathies to you and, of course, to the Scalia family.
Thank you for having me.
When we return, Nina Shea joins me to discuss the imminent dangers ISIS poses to minorities and Christians in Iraq and Syria, and why won't the State Department declare what's happening to them a genocide? The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Life for Christians in Iraq and Syria are considerably worse under ISIS. Both Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill, the Russian Orthodox leader, condemned the persecution of the Christian community in the region this past week. And earlier this month, the EU Parliament issued, finally, a resolution declaring ISIS's action a religious genocide. So why is the U.S. State Department so reluctant to designate this a Christian genocide? Joining me now is Nina Shea. She's the director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. She just wrote a blockbuster piece on this topic for National Review. Nina, thanks for coming back.
Thank you, Raymond.
Give me a sense of what is the reluctance? Why are they so painfully avoiding what is so obvious to the world?
Well, it's obviously political reasons because they've gone through thrown out a number of hurdles for us to address. They said we can't do it because we have no evidence of intent. That ISIS means to kill Christians.
Yeah, what does that mean? They said they have no evidence of intent. We've got dead bodies piled up. We've got people fleeing.
We have videos where they boast that they are beheading Christians because they're Christian. And there's written statements saying that they're going to break your crosses and enslave your women with a picture of St. Peter's with a black flag over it instead of a cross. And of course, most of the Christians in Iraq are Catholic of one kind or another, the Syriac or the Chaldean, and there's a lot of Orthodox as well.
Why, given all the reportage that you have done over the years, aid to the Church in Need, the Vatican Fides, all the various organs, why is the State Department relying exclusively on a report by the Holocaust Museum? It's a 28-page report. First of all, what is this, and why is it a problem?
Yeah, this is a 28-page trip report. The trip was done in September, and the State Department said they were relying on this report that was just released in October. So it was a very...
The State Department doesn't have its own people on the ground? They don't have their own investigators?
Of course they do. And they have a whole office on religious freedom and bureaus on the Middle East.
Well, which you sat on for several years.
Oh, yes, the Commission on Religious Freedom. So they have lots of resources. They chose to pin it on one because they wanted a certain outcome. And actually, some of those people who did the report for the Holocaust Museum worked in the administration before they went to the museum. So you just have to wonder if there was some collusion there and whether that was, advanced, they wanted a certain outcome.
And they don't have a problem saying Yazidis are being...
Right. Another ancient religion in the Middle East, they said, and of course it is, they suffered very, very badly at the hands of ISIS. There were thousands enslaved, 1,000 or more killed. But they're willing to say that Yazidis are victims of genocide, but they're not willing, they're silent on Christian genocide. And I really think that part of the problem, Raymond, is that we're seeing a repetition of what happened during the Jewish Holocaust, which is that there's a fear of feeding into the enemy propaganda. In this case, it's a Crusader war. In the case of the Jewish Holocaust, it's that the Allies were working on or intervening on behalf of the Jews. And so Roosevelt chose to remain silent, and it was catastrophic for the Jewish community. And this will be catastrophic for the Christian community.
What difference would it make if tomorrow the State Department came out and declared that this is indeed a Holocaust befalling the Christians in Iraq, in Syria, and other parts of the Middle East?
There are limited amounts of humanitarian aid, of generosity on the part of a very tired community of donors, and they're going to give to the group that they feel is suffering genocide. So if people come forward and say, well, there's the government, U.S. government comes forward and says, the Yazidis are facing genocide, the Christians aren't. Or just silent on the Christians, and no one really understands what's happening to them until it's too late.
Now, State Department officials tell me that the Genocide Convention has a clear statement, and it requires that the states act to prevent and protect victims of genocide, and that is where the reluctance to declare this a genocide might reside.
They may have a reluctance to act as well. And they're arguing that they don't want to send American troops storming in to save the Christians in Nineveh. Actually, we're already involved there. We have a military engagement. They wouldn't have to do anything. The convention does not prescribe any specific acts. And you can protect Christians in other ways and minorities in other ways. For example, letting them into our country for a refugee resettlement. We are bringing in 10,000 Syrian refugees this year. In the first quarter of fiscal year 16, we brought in basically one Christian family with 6 Syrian Christians from Syria. It's equivalent to one family.
And why do you think, given what we've seen, I mean, and as you say, since the Paris attacks, 2 Syrian Christian refugees, 602 Muslims have been allowed in the United States.
Yeah.
Why so few Christians? Given that the creators of this violence seem to be Islamic, not Christian.
Well, there's a reason for this, and I've delved into it and I've written about it. It's because the UN refers our refugees to us. And so it's only referring the Muslims who are living in the UN camps. Now, why don't Christians seek shelter in UN camps? Because they're too dangerous for them. And we're seeing some of this in Europe now with the migrants, where Germany is now saying, well, we've got to separate the Christians out from the Muslims because they're being preyed upon, by extremists that have mingled into that community. And the same thing happens in the Middle East.
The other argument I keep hearing from folks at the State Department vis-a-vis this declaration of genocide toward Christians, they say, look, ISIS gives Christians an option.
Yeah.
They can either convert or pay the jizya.
Yeah.
Now, the jizya is a tax. And they say, when you have this option, it's not a genocide, Nina Shea. You would say what?
Yeah, there's no evidence that it is an option, that there is any sign of Christian life at all anywhere in this so-called caliphate. So whether you're in Syria and Raqqa, or you're in Mosul or Nineveh in Iraq, there's no priests, there's no churches that are open. The churches have been destroyed or desecrated. There are no congregations assembling. No. There's no sign of Christian life.
And the bishops on the ground tell us.
The bishops on the ground, they said, look, it really was not a real offer. In fact, they made, the ISIS militants, when the bishops talked to them, made leering comments about the Christian girls. So they really, there was no trust there. And even President Obama's own counterterrorism official at the State Department, who's just left in the past year, he has said that this is just a publicity stunt by ISIS. This is a caliphate, the Islamic State publicity stunt to make them look like they're following a rule of law under the Koran. They're not. I mean, they do what they will.
Let's return to this question for a moment of refugees. ISIS has committed to sending terrorists in amid the refugees. Is that a reason for us to strengthen the screening and be doubly sure who's coming in? And are you concerned that we don't have those checks in place today?
Well, I think that we do have some checks in place. I'm not sure about the borders, but I'm from the UN Refugee Resettlement Program. I think we do have the checks in place. This is not the migration that we're seeing in Europe, where people have fake passports and no ID papers, and whoever just shows up is sort of admitted. They don't know what to do with them. But there has to be a long and really deliberative vetting process. And with the Christians, that's another reason that's just crazy and beyond me why we are not bringing in Christians, because they, number one, are victims of genocide, not just general migrants or opportunists for economic reasons, all of which are wonderful things, but they're actually facing a genocide of the entire community there. And it's very brutal and very violent. And they have baptismal certificates. They speak Neo-Aramaic, the language of Jesus Christ. I mean, you can't fake that.
Yeah. Do you support Turkey is making the offer of creating a safe zone in Syria for the Christians there, many of whom have already fled? Do you support that, or do you think it's too far out? These people have already dispersed.
Yeah, Raymond, I've been talking to a lot of refugees, Christian refugees, and many of them don't want to go back. They're deeply traumatized. They feel, and I've talked to several bishops, Bishop Jamo, a Chaldean bishop out in San Diego. He said that he said it right to me. He said that the culture has changed. It's a very extremist culture. ISIS has been teaching these kids now for several years the most horrible jihadist material and hatred against Christians. And the Christians have seen some of the local people buying the women at the slave markets. The UN wrote about that, by the way. Seeing them take down the crosses and seeing them looting their houses. There's not many of those Christians don't want to go back. They're deeply traumatized. They've lost loved ones. Everything they've owned has been taken from them.
I know a number of Christian leaders have asked for a meeting with Secretary Kerry and the State Department.
Yeah.
Those meetings have apparently been denied so far.
Right,
No
right.
acceptance, not even recognition the letter was sent.
The letter was sent on December 4th, and I was one of the signatories. So was Cardinal Wuerl, so was Carl Anderson of the Knights of Columbus, so was the head of the Pentecostal Assembly, so was Brian Catullus from the Center for American Progress on the left. So it was a real coalition.
Cross-section of people across the aisle. Here's the question. John Kerry met this week to discuss ISIS with Hollywood moguls about how to change the narrative. Is that a good use of his time?
No, he needs to meet with this group because what the purpose of the letter was to say, we want to brief you that there is the most heinous crime known to humankind is taking place against these minority communities, the Yazidis and the Christians. This group wanted to tell him about it and to tell him the limitations of even evidence gathering because it is still a war zone.
No,
still dangerous.
Let's hope that meeting eventually takes place. Nina Shea, thanks for awakening us to what's happening out there. And stay in touch. I know you are often in the region and in touch with people there. And
I will.
Your voice is important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that is all the time we have. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Don't miss next week. Mary Madeline will be here to analyze the latest news from the presidential campaign trail and much more. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thanks for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.